1857. In the candlelit hall of a southern plantation, 7 masters raised their glasses in celebration. From the smoke-stained kitchen, Martha Williams, an enslaved cook in a faded apron, carried out the final dishes. Outside, church bells rang like prayers in the night. Inside, a wooden spoon tapped gently against the rim of a pot, keeping time for an unseen verdict. A holiday meant for salvation had turned into a supper of judgment. Martha Williams was born not in a cradle but in a shack where smoke curled between the cracks of wood. The first lullabies she heard were not hymns, but the clatter of pans, the hiss of lard on a hot skillet, and her mother's whispering voice telling stories of escape. In the slave quarters, everything smelled of damp timber, sweat, and the bitter tang of smoke that clung to hair and skin. Childhood was not a season, it was a sentence measured by chores. The kitchen became her kingdom without a crown. It was the one place where a young enslaved girl could shape the world, if only for a moment, through flavor and fire. She learned to read sounds, the rolling boil that meant patience, the quick chop of a knife that meant speed, the silence of a master's glance that meant fear. She learned to read absence too, the absence of fathers sold south, of children taken overnight, of names that disappeared from the cabins and were never spoken again. While the big house gleamed with polished wood and imported china, the quarters were built of shadows and broken floorboards. Yet inside the kitchen, between pots blackened by years of use, Martha built a language of survival. A spoon became more than a tool. It became a witness. Her father had carved one for her on a rainy afternoon, smoothing the edges with a pocket knife, telling her that even wood could remember. She carried that spoon into adulthood as one might carry a relic, a small scrap of family in a world designed to erase family altogether. She grew tall, shoulders strong from lifting iron pots, arms scarred from sudden burns. By her teenage years, she was already known for a steady hand, a quiet patience, and the ability to season food so well that even those who owned her took note. The kitchen tied her to the plantation, yet it also gave her a vantage point. She overheard whispers, arguments, deals. She saw the hierarchy of the South not in books or ledgers, but in who sat at the table, who poured the wine, and who cleaned up after. Every meal taught her a truth. Power was not abstract. It had faces, it had voices, it demanded service. And Martha, still young, still silent, began to carry these truths like coals banked under ash, waiting for the day when fire would return. Among the quarters lived Samuel, a driver who laughed with his eyes even when his back was bent from labor. He was one of the few men who made Martha feel that life could stretch beyond the fences. In the hush of evenings, when work was done and the sky turned copper, they would talk about freedom as though it were a recipe, something you could prepare slowly, patiently, with the right ingredients. Time, labor, and faith. They promised each other a life beyond the gates, a small cabin of their own, perhaps a child who would know songs instead of orders. They traded vows the way others traded secrets, hoping to bind themselves to something larger than bondage. For a while, hope felt tangible, like bread rising, like seeds breaking through soil. But in the south of the 1852nd, promises were fragile things. One morning, the driver's cart carried Samuel not to work but to an auction block. His laughter, his eyes, his very body turned into currency for another man's debt. Martha heard about it not from Samuel but from the whispers of others. He's been sold, headed west. Their dream of freedom evaporated in the dust kicked up by horses. The cruelty did not stop with him. Soon after, Martha bore a child, a boy with Samuel's dimples. Before he could form the word mother, he too was taken, put down as credit for the next season, as the ledger coldly phrased it. For Martha, grief hardened into something else. Not a flavor she could stir out, not a wound that time could close. It became bitterness constant, undeniable, woven into memory like smoke into cloth. From that day, every meal she cooked carried the echo of loss. Not in taste her food remained praised, even demanded, but in silence. She no longer hummed while stirring. She no longer smiled when bread rose high. She worked with precision, but also with an absence that only she could feel. The wooden spoon, carved by her father, remained her only inheritance. When her son was sold, she held it tighter, as if the grooves in its handle could remind her of a lineage that the ledger tried to erase. To others, it was just a utensil. To Martha, it was a relic of continuity, the last anchor in a world built on rupture. Love had been sold. A child had been taken. What remained was a woman who now understood that waiting was futile. Waiting had been swallowed by commerce. Waiting had been burned away by the cruelty of men. All that remained was memory, and a fire banked deep within. Martha never wrote down plans. She counted. Numbers became her quiet arithmetic of resistance. She counted the footsteps of the overseer as he crossed the corridor, steady, arrogant, unthinking. She counted the toll of the church bell at dawn, each chime marking hours she could neither claim nor escape. She counted the chairs arranged around the dining table, polished oak and stiff-backed, each one a throne for a man who had made her life a ledger of loss. Inside the kitchen, every movement took on the weight of ritual. A spoon stirred not only broth but memory. A pan set upon the hearth was not just iron but symbol. To others, the kitchen was labor. To Martha, it was code. She created a language in gestures, stirring once slowly to mark patience, tapping the rim of a pot as though tapping a clock, laying out trays in an order only she understood. Silence became her accomplice. In the crackle of wood and the hiss of boiling water, she let her mind wander. Each repetition, the kneading of dough, the slicing of onions, the mopping of spills, became a rehearsal. No need for words, no need for paper. The kitchen itself remembered. Patience was a fire banked low, not dramatic, not noisy, just steady, smoldering, consuming wood bit by bit. Martha understood that to wait was not weakness. To wait was to shape time itself, to bide while those who believed themselves immortal lowered their guard. She counted even her own breaths, 1 when lifting the heavy pot, 2 when placing it on the wooden board, 3 when wiping her hands on the apron, stained with years of grease and flour. Every number was a step closer to inevitability. Outside, the world of the South spun on cotton harvested, sermons preached, ledgers balanced. Inside the kitchen, a woman traced the contours of destiny in the rhythm of her work. What others saw as routine, she knew to be prophecy. And so the spoon tapped, gently, rhythmically, like a metronome for a verdict unseen. They sat together, but they represented more than themselves. 7 men at a long table, bound not by kinship, but by privilege, by their shared dominion over bodies not their own. Henry Caldwell, the master of the plantation, his wealth lined with fear, gold in his chest, sermons on his lips, always quick to speak of order. He lived as though stability were carved in stone, though it was written in blood. Eli Caldwell, Henry's younger brother, a gambler who lost fortunes as though they were dice. To him, people were inventory, traded as casually as horses, their lives collateral for debts he never repaid. Overseer Brant, the whip in one hand, the hymnal in the other. He sang about salvation, even as he broke backs. His eyes were pale, his faith colder still. Reverend Pike, the preacher who spoke of obedience, standing on the backs of those forced to kneel. His Bible verses were chosen like chains, words bent to bind instead of free. Deputy Wren, law embodied not in justice but in iron. His cuffs and keys rattled like symbols of authority. His presence reminded all that the state was never neutral, it was forged to defend power. Factor LeMay, the merchant's hand, the middleman of misery. He wrote contracts, tallied goods, sold harvests. A signature from him could scatter a family across states. Paper was his weapon, ink his blade. Judge Hart, the voice of the court, the gavel that struck not to balance truth but to sanctify theft. He turned cruelty into legality with the weight of ritual, cloaking injustice in the robe of respectability. Each man was a fragment of a wall, and together they formed the fortress of slavery. To outsiders, it looked like society respectable, orderly, blessed by law and church. To Martha, it was a table set with faces of power, each one complicit in the theft of her life. The table gleamed with silverware, crystal glasses, roasted meats, but beneath the surface, it was no feast, it was an altar. Their laughter rose and fell. Their words crossed one another in casual arrogance, each convinced of his own permanence. 7 men, 7 pillars of a system, 7 names she had already counted, one by one, as though reciting scripture in reverse. At that table, they celebrated their dominion. At that table, Martha imagined their undoing. The dining room glowed with candlelight, as though the wax itself had been poured to honor wealth. Shadows swayed across the paneled walls, soft but restless, like secrets searching for air. Silver gleamed. Crystal glasses caught the flicker of flame. Outside, frost settled on the fields. Inside, the warmth was heavy, perfumed with spice, roasted meat, and the illusion of permanence. The chair at the head of the table shifted. Henry Caldwell straightened his back, adjusting a collar that felt more like armor than linen. Around him, the others leaned in, their voices weaving into one another like threads of the same fabric: gambling debts, sermons, court decrees, harvest tallies. Each man carried himself as though the world had been tailored to his exact size. Then came the food. Course after course, the meal unfolded with practiced elegance. Trays moved in and out. Dishes were set down with quiet precision. No one noticed the rhythm of the kitchen, the measured steps of Martha Williams, whose faded apron brushed the edges of the room like a shadow refusing to vanish. There were no cries, no drama, only subtle interruptions, an unfinished sentence, a glass left half raised, a sudden pause between bites. Conversation faltered not with noise, but with silence. A fork clinked against porcelain, too sharp. A napkin slipped to the floor and lay there like a fallen flag. The bread remained warm, the candles continued to drip, yet something intangible had shifted, thickening the air like smoke without fire. The silence was not absence, but density, pressing, growing, undeniable. No one at the table knew precisely when the moment arrived, when festivity bent into unease. Perhaps it was in the glance that lingered too long. Perhaps in the laughter that stopped a beat too soon. Whatever it was, the mood turned. The feast no longer felt like celebration. It felt like judgment disguised as ritual. And Martha, watching from the threshold of the kitchen, said nothing. Her hands were still. Her face gave no sign. But within her chest, a rhythm beat steady, like the tap of a wooden spoon against iron. A rhythm that had been counted for years. Inside her mind, Martha began a litany. A roll call, as deliberate as prayer. Henry, the master, his glass poised mid-air, fingers stiff, gold ring catching the candlelight. Eli, the gambler, his lips parted as though to speak, then closing again, silence swallowing his words. Brant, the overseer, a hand gripping the table's edge, knuckles pale, him long forgotten. Pike, the reverend, a throat cleared, but no sermon came. His Bible remained closed. Wren, the deputy, his boot tapped once, then stopped. Authority paused. LeMay, the factor, pen absent, contracts undone. A merchant with nothing to tally. Hart, the judge, his gaze lowered, as though the verdict had already been written. One by one, she called them in silence. Each name became an image, a frame from a film only she could see. A glass trembling, a candle's flame quivering, a napkin sliding soundlessly to the floor. No thunder, no spectacle, only small fragments, mundane gestures that, together, hinted at collapse. The room itself seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Words stumbled, laughter shrank. What had been noise turned to hesitation, then to stillness. And still, the bread was warm, the wine red, the meat untouched. Martha did not need to see the whole picture. She understood systems not as books of law but as habits of men. And now, those habits faltered. A fortress of order and authority, 7 men wide, showed its first cracks. Not from rebellion in the fields, not from armies or ballots, but from within the sanctity of their own table. Her breathing shortened, her steps quickened between kitchen and hall. Yet her mind was calm, clearer than ever. This was no accident. This was sequence. One name, then another. A chain unraveling not with shouts, but with silence. A system that had seemed eternal was now breaking like a door hinge pulled loose, slow, subtle, inevitable. And Martha, the quiet cook, stood as witness and architect both. The litany ended where it began. 7 names, 7 fragments. The table had never looked so fragile. The night had never sounded so still. The dining room dimmed, conversation had stuttered into silence, but the kitchen remained alive, fire crackling, iron pots humming low, shadows stretching along the walls. It was here, not in the courthouse or the chapel, that judgment gathered. Henry Caldwell entered first. The others lingered in the hall, their voices reduced to murmurs, as though distance could protect them from unease. He carried no weapon, no symbol of authority beyond the posture of a man long accustomed to obedience. Yet even that posture faltered as the heat of the kitchen met him. Martha stood upright, her frame outlined by the glow of the hearth. She did not cower, she did not bow. The wooden spoon rested in her hand, carved long ago by a father she barely remembered, smoothed by years of stirring, tapping, remembering. To her, it was no longer an instrument of labor but an emblem of witness, a relic that had absorbed every story told in smoke and steam. Their eyes met. In that exchange, centuries of hierarchy flickered. A man who had always looked down saw, for the first time, a gaze that did not bend. The kitchen walls seemed to tighten, pulling them into a chamber where there was no master, no slave, only two figures caught in the trial of history. No words could have shifted the balance, and yet words came. Henry spoke of betrayal, of order overturned, of a system that could not survive without obedience. His voice wavered, the edges of certainty fraying. Martha did not answer with pleas or arguments. She let silence hold the weight. Silence was enough. Above them, the chimney swallowed smoke, carrying it skyward as though testifying to the night. The clatter of the dining table was gone. Here, the only sound was fire breathing through wood. In that moment, the kitchen was no longer a place of service. It was a courtroom, and the verdict was already written, etched, not in parchment but in memory, in the very air they breathed. The overseer's lash, the reverend's sermons, the judge's gavel, all of it felt distant here. What remained was one man facing the truth of fragility, and one woman standing with the steadiness of years counted in silence. The system itself seemed to lean, as though the beams of the house recognized the imbalance. When Henry left the kitchen, he was smaller, not in stature, but in certainty. Behind him, Martha remained, spoon still in hand, face unflinching, the fire casting her shadow long across the floor. The trial was over. The sentence had been passed. Dawn arrived without kindness. The sky blushed pale, streaked with lavender and gray, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to watch. The trial was swift, as such trials always were. No jury of equals, no defense, no testimony allowed beyond the words of those who already held the verdict in their pockets. Witnesses were silenced. Records were abbreviated. What mattered was not truth, but performance. The ritual had to be completed to restore the illusion of order. Martha walked beneath that dim sky with her back straight. Chains rattled, but they did not define her step. Those who watched expected pleas, tears, bargains. Instead, they saw stillness, a dignity that unsettled. It is one thing to condemn a body, another to confront a spirit that refuses to bend. The gallows stood like an unfinished scaffold against the morning light, rough beams, a rope swaying in the cold breeze. An apparatus meant to erase quickly, to close the chapter, to instruct others in silence. Yet the very presence of Martha transformed the scene. The rope was no longer only punishment, it became symbol, a line drawn between oppression and defiance. She looked upward once, not toward heaven, but toward the horizon, where the fields stretched endless. Perhaps she thought of Samuel, perhaps of the child taken before he could speak her name, perhaps of her father carving a spoon on a rainy day, telling her that wood remembers. When asked for final words, she did not speak of vengeance. She spoke as though to the kitchen itself. Every spoon remembers, a phrase simple, almost domestic, yet it held centuries within it. The memory of meals cooked under command, the memory of families broken at tables not their own, the memory of quiet endurance that, at last, found its voice. The rope tightened, the sun rose higher. History turned its page. But the silence that followed was not erasure, it was echo. In cabins and kitchens, people repeated her words in whispers, as though tasting them. Wooden spoons tapped against iron pots like small drums of remembrance, and the system, though it endured, trembled with the knowledge that even silence could strike. Dawn had done its work, yet the verdict lingered, not in law books or sermons, but in memory. The great house stood quieter than before. Curtains were drawn earlier in the evenings, as if shadows had grown heavier. The dining table, once crowded with laughter and clinking glasses, seemed larger now, its empty chairs like wounds left unspoken. The town whispered, not loudly, fear rarely shouted but in half-sentences and careful pauses. The church bells rang longer, as though stretching their sound to cover unease. Laws tightened. Overseers grew harsher. Rituals of order reasserted themselves with brutal efficiency, yet none of it felt quite the same. The silence had weight. In the quarters, the story moved differently. Not shouted, not written, but breathed. Around fires, in low tones, people repeated what had happened. The supper, the silence, the trial at dawn. To the children, it became almost like a ghost tale. But unlike other ghost stories, this one did not frighten, it steadied. A ghost who did not haunt, but held. Children listened wide-eyed, not sure whether to fear or to admire. Mothers told them that courage could exist in quiet hands. Fathers said nothing, only nodded toward the kitchens where pots simmered, where spoons tapped rhythmically as though keeping memory alive. Martha's name was seldom spoken openly. To utter it was dangerous. Yet her absence was presence enough. The wooden spoon she once carried became legend. In whispers, people said it could still be heard, tapping iron, counting time. The men who had sat at the table adjusted their public lives, projecting normalcy, but privately, they carried unease. Some avoided the kitchen, as though fire and smoke now carried judgment. Others prayed more often, their voices trembling with uncertainty. For all their titles and wealth, they could not shake the memory of silence, of conversation cut short, of a feast that had turned into reckoning. History often records only the trials, the verdicts, the punishments, but among the enslaved, it was the aftermath that mattered, the way fear turned into story, and story into quiet solidarity. Something intangible had shifted. The system stood, yes, but its veneer cracked. Beneath the polished wood and gilded sermons, unease festered. And so, after the feast, nothing looked different, yet everything felt changed. Martha Williams did not enter the ledgers of history as a heroine. She was recorded as a warning, a cautionary tale, an example of what defiance would cost. Her name, if written at all, was footnoted beside words like crime, rebellion, execution. The archive reduced her to a line. But memory does not follow the same rules as ink. In kitchens, memory lingers like steam rising from stew. In spoons passed hand to hand, in recipes whispered without measurements, in fires tended patiently, memory endures. Martha's act was not preserved in statues or monuments. It lived in the rhythm of work, in the way a cook stirred slowly, then tapped the rim of the pot, as though keeping time with an unseen verdict. In the way children learned that silence could be more powerful than shouts. In the way a community, broken and scattered, found fragments of unity in the story of one who refused to bend. The bitterness of her life did not vanish with her death. It became part of the fabric woven into the culture of resistance that grew silently beneath the weight of chains. Long after the house collapsed, long after the names of the masters faded from records, the story of the feast remained. Not exact in detail, not always the same in telling, but true in essence, that even the smallest gesture, a spoon tapping iron, could hold the weight of defiance. And so her words lingered. Every spoon remembers, simple, domestic, yet enduring.